14 minutes. That's how long it took USS Washington to reduce a Japanese battleship into a burning wreck. 14 minutes of precision gunnery in total darkness at ranges where you couldn't see your target with the naked eye, using technology so new that most navies didn't believe it would work in combat. November 14th, 1942, off Guadalcanal, the only time in World War II that two battleships fought each other at night, and one of the most lopsided naval victories in history. This is the story of how American radar technology and one captain's aggressive tactics turned what should have been a confused melee into an execution, and why you've probably never heard of the most important battleship duel of the Pacific War. The Pacific War in late 1942 was brutal, chaotic, and far from decided. Guadalcanal had become the focal point of the entire theatre. The Marines had landed in August, seized the airfield, and now both sides were pouring resources into the island in a grinding battle of attrition. The Japanese Navy controlled the waters at night. American ships controlled them during the day. This pattern had held for months, with savage night battles that went badly for the Americans more often than not. The US Navy was learning painfully that the Japanese were better at night fighting, better trained, better equipped with optics, and armed with the Type 93 Long Lance torpedo, a weapon so superior to anything the Americans had that it seemed almost unfair. On the night of November 14th, the Japanese were coming down the slot, the channel through the Solomon Islands, with another attempt to bombard Henderson Field and land reinforcements. This had become routine. Japanese battleships would shell the airfield, wrecking planes and cratering runways, while transports unloaded troops and supplies. The pattern had worked before. Admiral Nobutake Kondo commanded the force. The battleship Kirishima heavy cruisers, light cruisers and destroyers. A powerful force, and Kondo was confident. Why wouldn't he be? The Japanese Navy had won nearly every night engagement so far. USS Washington was waiting. She'd arrived at Guadalcanal as part of a task force under Rear Admiral Willis Lee. And if you want to understand what happened that night, you need to understand Lee. He wasn't a typical battleship admiral. Lee had gone to Annapolis, yes, but he was known throughout the Navy as a gunnery expert and a technician. He'd won multiple gold medals in shooting at the 1920 Olympics. He understood ballistics fire control, and most importantly, he understood radar. While other admirals were skeptical of the new technology treating radar as a backup to visual spotting, Lee had spent months drilling his crews on radar-directed gunnery. Washington's crew could fire accurately at targets they couldn't see, guided entirely by electronic returns on a scope. Nobody else in the fleet could do this reliably. Some admirals didn't even believe it was possible. Lee's force was smaller than Kondo's Washington, the new battleship South Dakota, and 4 destroyers. South Dakota was technically the more modern ship, but she'd been having electrical problems. Problems that would in a few hours become catastrophic. The 4 destroyers were screening vessels there to spot torpedoes and provide warning. This was not a balanced task force. In a night engagement against a numerically superior enemy with better night fighting capabilities, Lee should have been at a severe disadvantage. Except Lee had radar, and he knew how to use it. The battle began around 11 p.m. when Lee's destroyers made contact with Japanese screening forces. What followed was chaos. The 4 American destroyers, Walk, Preston, Benham, and Gwynn, ran straight into a superior force of Japanese destroyers and cruisers. The Japanese did what they did best, launched torpedoes and opened fire with deadly accuracy. Within minutes, Walk was hit by multiple torpedoes and exploded. Preston took shell fire and torpedoes and sank quickly. Benham had her bow blown off. Gwynn was damaged and forced to withdraw. In less than 10 minutes, Lee's screen was gone. The destroyers had accomplished their mission. They'd given him warning and forced the Japanese to reveal their positions, but the cost was devastating. South Dakota moved forward to engage. For a brief moment, she was effective, her guns firing at Japanese destroyers and cruisers illuminated by the flames of burning American ships. Then her electrical system failed, not partially, completely. Every light went out, radar went dark, fire control went offline, radios died. She went from a modern battleship to a blind deaf target in seconds. The electrical failure was caused by a crew error earlier in the day, But in the middle of a night battle, the cause didn't matter. South Dakota was helpless. Japanese spotlights locked onto her. Searchlights from multiple ships turned night into day, and South Dakota took a beating. Shells hammered her superstructure. She took 27 hits from 5-inch, 6-inch, and 8-inch guns. One shell penetrated the conning tower, killing or wounding nearly everyone inside. Captain Thomas Gatch was wounded. The ship's doctor was killed. South Dakota was being torn apart, and she couldn't effectively fight back. The Japanese thought they'd won. Kondo's ships were focused on the illuminated battleship, pouring fire into her. The American destroyer screen was destroyed. One battleship was crippled. Kondo must have felt the battle was all but over. He didn't know that USS Washington was still out there, hidden in the darkness, watching everything on radar. Lee had held his fire. This was the crucial decision. When the destroyers were dying, when South Dakota was being lit up and pounded, Lee held his fire. He understood something that other commanders might not have. Firing would reveal Washington's position. The muzzle flashes from 16-inch guns are visible for miles. Once he opened fire, every Japanese ship would know exactly where he was. So he waited. He watched on radar as the Japanese ships focused on South Dakota. He maneuvered Washington to get into an ideal firing position. And when he finally gave the order to fire, it wasn't at the cruisers or destroyers that were hammering South Dakota. Lee had spotted something more important on his radar scope, Kirishima. The Japanese battleship was moving to finish off South Dakota, confident in her superiority. Japanese battleships had faced American surface forces multiple times by this point. They'd always won. Kirishima was a powerful ship, modernized in the 1930s, armed with 8 14-inch guns. She'd participated in earlier bombardments of Henderson Field. She was a veteran ship with a veteran crew. At approximately 11:17 p.m., she was 400 yards from USS Washington when Washington opened fire. The first salvo was a ranging shot, 3 16-inch shells from Washington's forward turret. They missed, but they established the range. The second salvo, fired seconds later with all 9 16-inch guns, didn't miss. Multiple shells hit Kirishima's superstructure and forward sections. The third salvo hit. The fourth salvo hit. Washington's fire control was devastatingly accurate. The radar gave her the range and bearing. The fire control computers, the most advanced in the world at that time, calculated the solution. The guns fired. The shells hit. Kirishima never knew what was happening. She couldn't see Washington, who was firing from outside visual range in total darkness. The Japanese spotted the muzzle flashes, but by then it was too late. Shell after shell slammed into Kirishima. Washington was firing full broadsides, 9 16-inch shells, weighing over a ton, each, leaving the guns at 500 feet per second. At that range, they'd penetrate any armor Kirishima had. The Japanese battleship's forward turrets were knocked out. Her superstructure was wrecked. Fires broke out throughout the ship. She tried to return fire, but her gunnery was wild, shooting at muzzle flashes, hitting nothing. The barrage lasted 7 minutes. Washington fired 75 rounds of 16-inch ammunition. At least 9 shells hit Kirishima, probably more counting hits. When a ship is being torn apart by repeated explosions is difficult. Beyond the main battery, Washington's 5-inch secondary guns were also firing, and some of those shells hit as well. The damage was catastrophic. Kirishima's steering jammed. Her speed dropped. She was taking on water. Multiple fires were burning out of control. Her crew was overwhelmed. Kondo tried to salvage the situation. Japanese cruisers fired at Washington, and some shells hit, but they weren't enough to seriously damage a battleship. Lee maneuvered Washington aggressively, maintaining range, continuing to fire. The Japanese launched torpedoes, but Washington's radar tracked them, and Lee's ship handling was excellent. He dodged every single one. Lee was demonstrating something that would become doctrine for the rest of the war: radar superiority, translated directly into combat superiority. He could see the enemy before they could see him. He could track their movements, their torpedo launches, their positions. The Japanese were fighting blind, while Washington had perfect situational awareness. By 11:30 p.m., barely 13 minutes after Washington opened fire, Kirishima was finished as a fighting unit. She was burning, listing unable to maneuver properly. Kondo, recognizing the disaster, ordered a retreat. Japanese ships laid smoke and withdrew. South Dakota, her electrical power partially restored, also withdrew. Lee considered pursuit, but decided against it. He'd accomplished his mission. The bombardment force was driven off. Henderson Field would not be shelled that night. The Japanese transports would not land their troops. Guadalcanal was safe. Kirishima didn't sink immediately. She drifted for hours, her crew fighting fires and flooding. They tried to get her under control, but the damage was too severe. The ship was doomed. Eventually, her captain gave the order to abandon ship. Japanese destroyers took off survivors. Then they scuttled her with torpedoes. Kirishima sank north of Savo Island in the early morning hours of November 15th. She'd been a powerful modern battleship. She'd lasted 14 minutes against USS Washington's gunnery. The implications of this battle were enormous, but it took time for them to be understood. This was the first time radar-directed gunnery had destroyed an enemy capital ship at night. Washington had hit a target she couldn't see with the naked eye, at ranges where visual aiming was impossible with accuracy that shocked even the US Navy's own analysis after the battle. The 9 16-inch hits represented a hit rate of 12%, with the main battery extraordinarily high for naval gunnery at night at range against a moving target. The Japanese Navy, which had dominated night fighting for months, suddenly faced a reality where their advantages were negated. Optical superiority didn't matter if the enemy wasn't using optics. Superior training for visual spotting was worthless if the enemy was firing guided by radar. The long-lance torpedo was still deadly, but only if you could get close enough to launch it, and radar made that much harder. The Battle of Guadalcanal effectively ended Japanese battleship operations against American surface forces. They'd try again, certainly, but the easy victories were over. For the US Navy, the lessons were equally profound. Radar worked. Not just for detection, not just for navigation, but for actual fire control in combat conditions. This validated years of investment in radar technology and fire control computers. It also validated Lee's methods. Other admirals had been skeptical, but Lee had proven that with proper training and aggressive tactics, radar superiority could overcome numerical inferiority and even tactical surprise. South Dakota's crew probably didn't feel like they'd won a great victory. They'd taken serious damage. 29 men were killed, including the ship's doctor and several officers. 33 were wounded. The superstructure was riddled with shell holes. It would take weeks of repairs before she could fight again. But South Dakota had done her job, perhaps unintentionally. By drawing Japanese attention and fire, she'd allowed Washington to remain hidden until the perfect moment. South Dakota took the punishment that might otherwise have been shared, and in doing so, she contributed to the victory even while crippled. The 4 destroyers that were sunk or damaged represented a heavy cost. 175 sailors died when Walk exploded. 117 went down with Preston. Those destroyers had fought against superior forces and bought time with their lives. Naval battles have a brutal calculus. The destroyer's sacrifice allowed the battleships to engage. The battleship's engagement saved Guadalcanal. Guadalcanal's survival eventually led to Japanese defeat in the Solomon Islands. Thousands died, so that the strategic situation could shift slightly in America's favor. That's how attritional wars work. Lee himself never got the recognition he deserved. He continued to serve with distinction, commanding battleship divisions in later operations. In 1945, while serving as commander of Battleship's Pacific Fleet, he died of a heart attack aboard his flagship. He was 57. The Navy mourned one of its best tactical commanders, a man who'd understood that technology and training could overcome traditional advantages. Lee's legacy lived on in doctrine and tactics, but his name never became as famous as some other admirals. He fought one perfect battle, destroyed a battleship in 14 minutes, and then continued doing his job until his heart gave out. Washington herself had a distinguished but quiet career after that night. She participated in numerous operations throughout the Pacific. She provided fire support for invasions. She screened carriers. She did the unglamorous work that kept the fleet operational. She never fought another battleship, because after November the 14th, 1942, Japanese battleships largely avoided direct confrontation with American surface forces. Washington's one night of glory had been so devastating that it changed enemy behavior. She was decommissioned in 1947 and scrapped in 1961. No effort was made to preserve her. The battleship that had fought the last battleship versus battleship night action in history ended her life, being cut apart in a scrapyard. Why isn't this battle better known? Partly because it happened in the middle of a larger naval battle. The Naval Battle of Guadalcanal was a 3-day affair involving multiple engagements. Washington's duel with Kirishima was one piece of a bigger picture, partly because battleship actions in World War II are overshadowed by carrier battles. Midway, Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf. Those are the famous names. Surface actions between battleships seem almost old-fashioned by comparison, relics of an earlier era. And partly because the US Navy had a lot of victories to celebrate. One more engagement, even a decisive one, got lost in the flood of successes as the war turned in America's favor. But the Battle of Guadalcanal, specifically Washington's destruction of Kirishima, represents something significant. It was the moment when technology definitively shifted naval warfare. Radar wasn't theoretical anymore. It wasn't experimental. It was a war-winning advantage that changed tactics doctrine and strategic calculations. The Navy that had better radar, better fire control computers, and better training in using them would win night battles. The Japanese had spent decades perfecting night fighting techniques based on optics and training. In 14 minutes, all of that became obsolete. There's something almost surgical about Washington's gunnery that night. This wasn't two battleships pounding away at each other in a slugging match. This wasn't the kind of battle people imagine when they think of battleship duels, two massive ships visible to each other trading broadsides, crews cheering, flags flying. This was clinical. Washington used technology to achieve what amounts to an ambush. She saw Kirishima on radar, calculated a firing solution, and destroyed her before Kirishima could effectively respond. It was efficient, effective, and utterly one-sided. The human element remains striking. Lee's decision to hold his fire while his destroyers were dying required iron discipline. The crews on Washington who maintained their stations, who trusted their radar and fire control computers, who fired into darkness at a target they couldn't see, that required training and confidence that most navies didn't have. The South Dakota sailors who kept fighting while their ship was being torn apart, who didn't panic when everything went dark, who survived and eventually brought their damaged ship home. That was courage under the worst possible circumstances. Kirishima's crew fought their ship until she was unsalvageable, then evacuated in good order and scuttled her properly. Japanese naval discipline held even in defeat. Those sailors had no idea what hit them, had no chance to fight back effectively, but they did their duty until the end. War doesn't care about fairness. Technology, training, and tactics determine who lives and who dies. And that night, the Japanese were on the wrong side of all three. The Battle of Guadalcanal as a whole was a meat grinder. Ships sunk, thousands dead, both sides claiming victory. But when historians look at the turning point of the Pacific War, Guadalcanal is always mentioned. The island became the symbol of American determination and Japanese overreach. The naval battles around Guadalcanal were where the US Navy learned how to fight at night, where radar doctrine was developed, where the balance of power shifted. And on the night of November the 14th, 1942, USS Washington demonstrated exactly how that shift would work. 14 minutes of gunnery, 9 16-inch shells on target, 1 battleship sunk. The only battleship versus battleship night action of World War II. USS Washington's crew probably didn't realize they were making history. They were just doing their jobs, using their training, trusting their equipment. Lee probably didn't think he was revolutionizing naval warfare. He was applying doctrine he'd spent months developing, using technology he understood better than most admirals. But that's often how military history works. The most important moments don't feel historic at the time. They feel like chaos, fear training kicking in, and people trying not to die. The wreck of Kirishima lies in deep water north of Savo Island. Washington's metal was melted down decades ago. The men who fought that night are mostly gone now. But the battle remains significant because it represents a transition point. Naval warfare entered the night of November the 14th, 1942, with one set of rules and left with another. Technology had caught up to tradition, training had overcome experience, and one American battleship commanded by an admiral who understood both technology and tactics had demonstrated that night fighting could be dominated through radar and fire control rather than optics and instinct. That's USS Washington's legacy, not the most famous battleship, not the most decorated, but for 14 minutes on a dark night off Guadalcanal, she was the most effective ship in the world. She destroyed a battleship in combat so decisively that it changed how navies thought about night fighting. That matters more than fame. That's the kind of victory that wins wars.